Good afternoon. Thanks for coming to our final panel of today's symposium. So for those who don't know me, my name is Osamah Khalil. I'm the organizer of today's symposium. I'm a professor in the history department. Some of you also attended last night's movie, which served as a bookend to this symposium, which looked at the Japanese-American incarceration during World War II and its enduring legacy, particularly its impact on immigration policies. And as I noted during last night's movie, and as we talked a little about this morning, in the morning panels, the symposium is unfortunately very timely in a number of different ways. On the issue of immigration, over the past week, there have been a series of forced resignations and firings at the Department of Homeland Security, which oversees a number of the governmental agencies that are responsible for immigration issues. And at the same time, this comes as the Trump administration is directly linked to the Trump administration's continued attempts to manufacture a crisis on the U.S. southern border. So how many of you, the clip I played, how many of you have heard or seen that or know of it? Do you know what it is? Do you know the context for that? I could see the parents in the room wincing because, So that was taken over the summer. It was secretly recorded at a detention facility at the height of the family separation crisis, which is still ongoing. And that was a young girl, a 6-year-old girl, crying almost nonstop. And another girl who was pleading with the border officials that she had memorized her aunt's phone number and wanted to be put in touch with her aunt in the United States. So this, once this was leaked to the ProPublica organization, this created a bit of a firestorm, but apparently not. And it put pressure on the Trump administration related to family separation to, quote unquote, end this policy. Although they have recently admitted that there are thousands of children, quite frankly, and it will take months, if not at least a year or more, to reunite them with their parents. So in that light, the administration's zero-tolerance policy on immigration, including family separations I just talked about, for those, how many of you are familiar with this policy of family separation before I go too far in? Okay. And the denial of entry to asylum seekers is only exacerbating this existing immigration issue, which of course predates the Trump administration. But these policies build on the administration's travel ban, as was talked about last night, and which was instituted shortly after President Trump came to office, and after several modifications was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. So although the zero-tolerance policies, including family separation and denial of asylum, denial of entry to asylum seekers, which is a violation not only of U.S. law but international law, is currently being challenged, as we talked about last night, it's unclear that there will be relief in the courts. And these immigration policies fit into a longer history of demonizing and targeting others that predates the current administration and is not just limited to the U.S., as we'll talk about with our transnational panel. This fits into a very broader trend around the world. So with that, by way of that introduction, allow me to introduce our very distinguished panel. Jan Dowell is professor in SU's philosophy department. Her areas of research are ethics, metaphysics, philosophy of the mind, and philosophy of language. She's also the head of Syracuse Divest, an organization dedicated to securing SU's public commitment to for-profit prison divestment. Shana Kushner Gadarian is associate professor of political science at the Maxwell School. She studies American politics with a focus on political behavior and political psychology. And her book, Anxious Politics, Democratic Citizenship in a Threatening World, won the Robert Lane Award for Best Book in Political Psychology from the American Political Science Association. Audie Klotz, how was that? Is that okay? I got it. Sorry, close enough? All right. Is a professor of political science here at the Maxwell School. She's the author of 2 books, including Migration and National Identity in South Africa, 1860 to 2010, and she's co-edited 2 volumes. She's also the author of a co-author of a third book, and has won 2 career honors from the International Studies Association. The first is the Tickner Award in 2014 for innovative scholarship, and the second was in 2018, the Distinguished Scholar Award of the Ethnic Nationalism and Migration section. And finally, Sefa Secen is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Political Science, who his general research areas include refugees, minority rights, and Middle Eastern politics, and he's currently working on his dissertation, which focuses on securitization of Syrian refugees in Turkey and Lebanon. So please join me in welcoming our panel. So, yeah, I mean, it's up to you if you want to sit or you want to stand. Okay.
I don't have slides because I didn't have enough time, so I apologize. Normally, I start with a slide that says Africa is not a country. Kind of harks back to Azra's slide earlier today about the former Yugoslavia. So what I would add to Osamah's otherwise very generous introduction is that I have been working on researching and teaching migration issues for about 20 years. And between my own research in Southern Africa, Europe, and North America, as well as teaching on pretty much every other region of the world. And I have to follow what's going on in the United States. Only recently have I started doing some mostly historical research on the United States, but as a consumer of U.S. immigration policy and some of its disasters, from my perspective in the last 2 years, I've had to learn all about the intricacies of the American court system and whatnot. So I will set aside my personal views after I pronounce that Stephen Miller, who is the major advisor in the current White House, in my view, deserves, and I hope at some point will be charged with crimes against humanity. So you know where I'm coming from. On a more analytical note, I can't address all of the wonderful questions that Osamah circulated, so I thought I would shift gears a little bit and ask everybody in the room, speaking of strategies of resistance, to think about two things. One is a set of terminologies that are currently used and broadly used in discussions of immigration and migration policies, and then a little bit, depending on my time, a little more briefly about how we think about comparisons and what, if anything, are the relevant comparisons for what's going on in the United States. Okay, so first let's start just with that term refugee. Right? Refugee has a colloquial meaning, but refugee also has a very precise meaning in international law. The current administration is playing around with that definition, which includes a fundamental principle called non-refoulement, which is you will not eject an asylum seeker back into harm's way, basically. The United States is not the only country messing around with the technical definitions and precise implications of some policies towards asylum seekers. But it's very important for those of us who care about the politics of this situation to be careful in expressing humanitarian solidarity. So when I hear otherwise very understandable expressions about sympathy towards people coming from Central America who are trying to achieve a better life, it plays into the denialists about asylum and refugees because it makes it look like, oh, they really just want to come here for economic reasons, when in fact, they do fall generally under the principles of the international definition of refugee, which focuses on persecution and various categories of persecution, including social group. There are also important distinctions about transit countries, and we do not talk enough about Mexico in this situation. So one of many reasons I would like you to always just be conscious about when and how you use the term refugee, and encourage you to use it in the technical international legal sense and less so in the more emotive humanitarian sense, even though that may be what resonates for you. There's this broader question of what is a crisis. There are theoretical and political meanings to the word crisis. In the introduction, apparently Sefa is going to talk about securitization and securitization theory, so I will not go in great detail. I will only emphasize that for the last 30 years or so, there is a thriving literature in international relations on securitization, and it deals in particular with this notion of crisis and the use of rhetoric to trigger crises that enable governments to then do things, emergency measures. So everything that the Trump administration is doing by invoking a crisis on the border fits exactly into the framework of securitization theory. So I encourage you not to just loosely use the term securitization or crisis, right? Unless you want to delve into the more precise theoretical ways in which it's used, in which case I encourage you to make those connections. Third term, which absolutely drives me bonkers, is white nationalism. It is not nationalism. It is transnationalism. There is a 200 or more year history of transnational white supremacists. They rise, they decline. At the moment, it's a bit resurgent, but there are a lot of similarities. There are many lessons we could learn. But every time somebody uses the word nationalism, they negate the transnational aspects of it. I will give you just a few. The Rhodesian military insignia is apparently very trendy amongst radical right advocates, including the man who shot dead people in the Charleston church. As a specialist on Rhodesia and the Zimbabwean transition, I find it appalling that people have rediscovered this insignia. I find it also ironically amusing that they are invoking yet another failed military, just like the Confederates. So we will move on. They also have in Eastern Europe appropriated the Confederate flag. So it is not a lost cause that's about heritage, not hate. It is a very potent transnational symbol of hate. So we need to be bringing these things out into the open, and anytime somebody talks about nationalism, it presumes that the politics is local, not international. I could spend a lot more time talking about and unpacking what is white nationalism. All you have to do is go back to Wilson's 14 points in the implementation of self-determination to see some lessons about how, for the last 100 years or so, nationalism has been appropriated in certain sorts of ways. We need to obviously unpack race along lines of ethnicity, religion. I would add that xenophobia, as much as it is problematic, is not always racism. There is xenophobia in South Africa, Africans attacking other Africans. So what specifically is xenophobia versus racism? I am not saying that we should reject racism or xenophobia as categories. I think we need to think about them in precise ways. So I can give you lots of other examples about the transnationalism of this. There's the literacy test that started in the southern United States and spanned to South Africa and went around to Australia and all sorts of other places. There were the Quota Acts in the 1930s that spread all around the world. So we should be careful about what we consider quote-unquote best practices. That brings me to my second set of questions, and here I'm going to be a little brief, I hope. How do we decide what to compare? The joke in the political science department is every time I say, well, maybe the Americanists could add a Canada comparison. And they chuckle, chuckle, chuckle. Oh, you teach a course on Canada. Ha, 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 ha. Right. Well, fortunately, Shana is one of my few Americanist colleagues who's actually venturing out into the world of comparative politics. Yay, thank you. But it's interesting to me that, especially in the discussion about radical right and white nationalism, the comparisons that everybody wants to make, understandably, are about Nazi Germany. I understand that emotionally. But it'll be to places like Hungary and whatnot. And I'm like, are those really the appropriate comparisons from a comparative politics, how do you pick your case selection kind of question? Or maybe there's some other things going on there, like Americans are willing to compare themselves to Europeans, but they're not willing to compare themselves maybe to other parts of the world. And you guessed it, South Africa. Right, we had a panel this morning we had two panels this morning where South Africa would have fit really nicely. There was a big debate about the transition or the defeat of apartheid in the 1994 elections as whether or not it was the consequence of the collapse of the Cold War, for instance. But more relevant would be there was a discussion about what is democracy and what is authoritarianism, and the panelists were all kind of stepping back from that. But South Africa was always a mix of authoritarianism and democracy, limited democracy. So when the Trump election came down the pike, on what was that, November 9th, 2016, I was having an out-of-body experience, because I always wondered, what would I have done if I had been living in South Africa in 1948 when the Nationalists got elected? For those who don't know any South African history, the Nationalists were radical right on a spectrum of racists. They were radical right. They won as a minority government because of an electoral system that gave higher percentage to rural votes versus urban votes. Sounds a little familiar. They manipulated all sorts of electoral rolls after that. They eliminated what was called the colored vote. They packed the bureaucracy with their supporters. Shock. They took over the courts. They didn't completely succeed. And they treated all Africans as migrants and criminals. That was the apartheid system. It was a system of migration control. The South African government, in implementation, except for whites, was an authoritarian government. If the apartheid system failed to manage African migration, why in the world do any other governments around the world think that they can control borders? There are a lot of really sad, enervating, but optimistic lessons from the apartheid experience. First, it failed. Second, is my silver lining, there is a little bit of resilience in the legal system that survived 40 plus years. I put a lot of my donations into the legal NGOs that are doing all these court filings, by the way. But also there is really long-term damage. So even if you think that solving this problem in the next 2 years by getting out to vote and all that is a solution, it is a partial solution. But long-term damage takes a really long time, and it's incomplete. Right now, South Africa is celebrating 25 years of democracy. It has elections in about a week. There's a lot of internal scrutiny going on in South Africa about the strengths and weaknesses of its experiences with these legacies. I encourage you to go beyond Trevor Noah, but use him as your entree into understanding what has been going on and take some lessons from it.
Thank you, Audie.
All right. Well, thank you for the opportunity to share. So Osamah asked us to speak to many questions, including the relationship between immigration and national security. What I study is the ways in which average people think about and react to crises, whether or not they are real or whether or not they are actual crises on the ground. And so this is a project that I've been working on with some European colleagues looking at reactions to terrorist attacks in Europe in 2015. So I'm going to breeze through a lot of the background, but just so to understand the context in which we're working in, we're looking at how average people across 5 countries, 4 in Europe, 1 in the US. So I am now doing, I generally work in the US, I'm now doing comparative work, and it's hard, right? Comparing countries is hard. But looking, we are going to be looking at the relationship between people's concerns and fears of terrorism and then their immigration attitudes and attitudes about refugees in the wake of terrorist attacks in Europe. So just to give you kind of a very brief overview, we're working in a kind of context where there's been an increasing number of terrorist attacks in Europe from about 2015 to 2017. Okay, and at the same time, we have the largest mass migration of people since World War II coming into Europe at the same time, right? We have more than 1 million refugees and migrants coming into Europe, mostly as a function of war in the places where people are coming from. These people who are coming into Europe in this time period are ethnically and religiously distinct from the majority native populations in most of the host countries they're going to. So we're talking about many ways in which the refugees coming into Europe are different in ways that are threatening to the people on the ground. And immigration, as you might remember, played a large role in the American presidential campaign in 2016, the Brexit discussions. general underlies attitudes about populism in Europe. So we have these kind of two streams of what we might consider either real or created crises. And at the same time, we have political rhetoric coming from particularly the right in America and Europe that makes this connection between fears of terrorism, right, so actual attacks, and blaming either that terrorism on immigrants and refugees themselves, or saying that one of the ways to be safe is to close borders and to keep the native population safe from these scary immigrants. So this is Donald Trump calling for a complete and total shutdown of Muslims entering the U.S. in December 2015, which again, he implements as quickly as he can once taking office. Again, gets stopped by the courts briefly, but then is essentially, this ban is essentially in law. Okay, so again, happy to answer questions in Q&A about all of the kind of political psychology here, but our theory is that threats about terrorism increase worry about terrorism. And when people are worried, they seek out policies that they believe will protect them, okay? And those policies that people are sold as protective often are ones that are, again, ones that will limit immigration. Particularly when immigrants themselves are seen as an outgroup, they're threatening on a cultural or economic level. Again, that doesn't mean they are in fact threatening. It's the perception of threat which is most important here. Okay? And we also know that terrorism decreases trust in outgroups. Okay? So I'm going to skip some. So how do we test this theory? We have a set of surveys that we send out into the field across 5 countries. Again, Norway, Finland. I should say this is joint work with the Institute for Social Research in Oslo, Norway, and it is funded by a grant from the Norwegian Research Council, and France and Spain and the United States. We use Gallup there, and we have 2 waves of data right after the Paris attacks, about 3 weeks after we're in the field, December 2015. We have about 7,800 respondents across those 5 countries. We asked them survey questions about their concerns about terrorism and a lot of questions about their immigration attitudes. In January 2017, we go back to a subset of those people, 2,300 of them, and then we have a new fresh cross-section of people of 7,800 people. So in total, we're talking about 18,000 people we've surveyed over these 2 time periods. Okay, so just to give you a sense of the data, we asked people how worried they are about themselves becoming a victim of a terrorist attack or a family member, and how worried they are about a future terrorist attack. So this goes, just briefly, from not at all worried to very worried on this x-axis here. Okay, so people across, and this is the 2 time periods, 2017 are the blue dots, 2015 are the gray diamonds here. So a couple things to note. 1, people are very concerned about becoming victims or their countries being victimized by terrorism over these 2 time periods. And there's not a ton of difference between people in France who actually had those experiences of a terrorist attack and people in the US and Norway who did not, okay? Part of this, I think, is a story about the media, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. When we ask people, should your country stop accepting refugees, okay, the higher the bar, the more likely they are to say, this is averages across the countries, the more likely they are to say, yes, our country should stop taking refugees, right? Again, the politicians are making this connection for people between terrorism comes from refugees, and we should stop refugee flows in order to be safer. Okay, the highest support for that is in France, but the U.S. is not far behind. Again, the U.S. did not experience the Paris attacks directly. Okay, so I know there's a lot of dots here, but our expectation is, right, that the more worried people are about terrorism, that's every single dot here is going, the x-axis is the fear of terrorism, so the more fearful you are about terrorism, the more likely you are in every country, okay, to want to tighten immigration, you want stricter control of refugees, the less likely you want it to integrate immigrants you already have, okay? The more worried you are about terrorism, even in a country like Norway, which one, doesn't have a lot of immigrants, and two, has not experienced terrorism quite like this, the less likely you are to be supportive of immigration policy. And I'm just going, and for those of you who are wondering, we have 2,000 people who we asked in both 2015 and 2017. The fear of terrorism predicts your attitudes about immigration in 2017 almost as well as it does in 2015. So this is a very long-lasting effect. Okay, the other thing that we find is that for people, again, fear of terrorism is here on the x-axis. For people who are fearful of terrorism, the less trusting they are in Muslims. This is not and immigrants. This is not true if you ask them how much they trust Christians. This is the effect of fear of terrorism does not predict your attitudes about Christians in the same way that it does Muslims. Okay, so I'm just going to. Yeah, okay. So just as an overall, to wrap up, fearful publics want a more restrictive immigration, refugee, and integration policies. This affects both non-citizens and religious minorities. And it's the question of the whole project is whether or not societies can become resilient in the face of terrorism. I think there's large questions about whether or not that is possible. Thanks.
Thanks, Shana. Yeah, let me switch over.
Okay, hi everybody. These are not my slides. Oh yeah, these are my slides. I want to particularly talk about, securitization of Syrian refugees in Turkey and Lebanon. But before doing that, I want to talk about securitization briefly. That's the theoretical aspect of my dissertation project. Audie also kind of emphasized the fact that we shouldn't be using this term in a very loose way, right? And I agree with that. Securitization in general, it is kind of discussing an issue mainly in reference to military, societal, economic, and political security. And all these different sectors of security can be, identified in many different ways as well. But here I'm not going to go into the details of those. I'll just kind of these are some images from my case countries. The first two images are from Turkey and Lebanon. The other images are from this image is from Germany and that one is from the United States. I'll kind of discuss these images in relation to domestic political developments taking place in those countries. When the refugees enter into a country, not only their kind of physical presence, okay, they're gonna become physically present in another country, but their political impacts or social impacts are gonna be discussed by the majority, right? And different groups within, host countries might have different positions towards refugees. For example, in those countries, not only political parties, but different segments of the society, religious groups, political groups, also have different attitudes towards refugees. For example, I'm going to discuss the first image from Turkey. This is this lady that you see on the sign. Actually, she was running in the local elections, which took place almost 2 weeks ago in Turkey. And this was one of her this was a part of her election rhetoric. This translates as, it's in Turkish, it says Fatih Suriyelilere teslim etmeyeceğim. In English, it means we're not going to surrender this local place to the Syrian refugees. That's, of course, that can be discussed in relation to many other things in the country, but that by itself, kind of a sign of securitization, and she is a member of an ultra-nationalist political party. That political party only represents maybe 10% of the Turkish society, but still, that has become a political rhetoric being used by a political party. And the second image is from Lebanon, and the sign says, this is from demonstrations anti-Syrian refugees in Lebanon. The sign says, كي لا نخسر لبنان فوضى الحكومة السورية. Meaning that, to not to lose Lebanon, let's negotiate with the Syrian governments, because some forces within Lebanon, I can talk about the Lebanese political system because it's a conventional democracy. The president is a Maronite Christian, prime minister is a Sunni Muslim, and the head of the parliament is a Shia Muslim. The political powers are kind of divided between the different sectarian powers. And mainly, since most of the Syrian refugees are Sunni, non-Sunni political forces in Lebanon, they see Syrian refugees as a potential threat to their political status. But that's not because of the fact that they don't like refugees. That's just because of the fact that presence of Sunni Syrian refugees will have certain implications for their political status in the country, right? Because then Sunnis are going to make up the majority, and that's going to impact the political system. And this sign says, again, to not to lose Lebanon, negotiate with the Syrian government, and find a way to return refugees back to Lebanon. Audie also briefly talked about this term, refugee in international relations. We have to use it very carefully. Syrian refugees in Lebanon, they're refugees under international law. They're recognized as refugees by the UNHCR, registered as refugees by UNHCR. But the Lebanese government does not really recognize them as refugees, call them nazihun. Nazihun means guests. They don't have this refugee status. And at the same time, despite the fact that under international law, none of the countries can involuntarily repatriate refugees, main political parties in Lebanon today are negotiating the kind of involuntary repatriation of Syrian refugees. And that's partly, maybe mostly related with the sectarian makeup of the political system. And there's, of course, economic factors affecting people's and political parties' attitudes towards Syrian refugees. Because Lebanon is a small country, its population used to be 5 million before the refugee crisis. Today, its population is 6 million, and there are 1 million Syrian refugees. And as you would imagine, the country's population increased 20% within the matter of a couple of years, and that's going to have certain, consequences for the country and for the economy. And given the fact that Lebanon is not a very developed country, it lacks, basic economic resources, then that kind of even creates further problems. And this, this one is this image from Germany. Let us make Germany great again. This was from one of the protests against Syrian refugees in Germany. I think most of the attendees were the members of the Alternative Germany Party, the new nationalist party. They are also mainly using an economic logic to kind of criticize Merkel's policies towards Syrian refugees. Refugees within that context are mainly seen as an economic threat, kind of draining the state's resources, putting a new burden on the economy. And the last one is from the United States, and in parallel to Shana's presentation, within the kind of United States context, especially refugees from Muslim majority countries are more likely to be associated with kind of terrorism. And that logic becomes kind of the ground to adopt anti-refugee policies. Okay, and just talking about Syrian refugees, these are some basic statistics. When we talk about refugees, that's different than the migration in general. Most of the Syrian refugees are in the Middle East. There are 6 million Syrian refugees, and 5 million of them, are being hosted in the Middle East. On the basis of these numbers, we could say that, it shouldn't be such a great threat for the countries in the periphery and for the overseas countries, right? Because most of the refugees are in the Middle Eastern countries. And this is where the securitization becomes important, right? It's not only about the numbers, it's not only about the realities on the ground, the number of refugees, right? It's about how, a periphery country or an overseas country, perceives the situation. For example, Brexit. I don't know how many refugees the UK has admitted so far, but it was a big issue for the UK, and I think played an important role, in the Brexit decision. And for other European countries, for Hungary, for Poland, right? I think the Middle Eastern refugee crisis wasn't really a big crisis for those countries because like not many refugees ended up living in those countries, but still the refugee crisis in the Middle East made a huge impact on those countries, on the political system, not on the political system, but on the kind of like, on the election results. In Poland, the Nationalist Party came to power, and that can be said in some of the other countries as well. And about the EU, right? Some of the EU member countries violated some of the essential rules of the EU, right? For example, like Hungary just built fences to prevent the entry of refugees, and that was a violation of Schengen visa system, right? In the European Union, it's a borderless continent, under the rules of the EU, but states started to kind of strictly protect and police their borders in the face of the Syrian refugee crisis. And I think that was my answer to the first question. Immigration is not a natural, maybe security threat, especially for the, and refugees, especially the Syrian refugees. They are not a direct, security threat for most of the European countries and for the United States, but they have been presented so in some cases, and I think that shows the impact of this, process of securitization. No matter whether they kind of pose real threats to those countries, they can be presented as security threats, depending on the, domestic context and politics. I think that's all for the first couple of questions.
Thank you, Sefa.
Do you have the mouse?
Yeah, we've got your.
Hi, is this on? It's not wholly irrelevant to what I'm going to say. So as Osamah mentioned in the introduction, I'm Jan Dowell. I'm actually in the philosophy department, so my research is not political science. My research is not in immigration policy. The reason I'm here today is because I'm head of Syracuse Divest, which is an on-campus organization dedicated to securing our university's public commitment to divestment from the for-profit prison industry. So you might wonder, why the heck is someone who is trying to convince the university to divest from the for-profit prison industry here today talking about immigration policy and national security? So one of the questions that we were asked to speak to was the question of the role that national security threats play in explaining our current immigration policies. Is it the case that genuine national security threats are playing a role in explaining the expansion of immigrant detention in the U.S. in the last 2 years? Or rather, is that just a manufactured explanation for the increase in detention? Is there rather some other explanation? And so that's where my background in for-profit prisons comes in. So if you look at the data, and I'll throw some data up on the board, you'll notice that there's by far and away, a greater correlation between lobbying by the for-profit prison industry over the last 2 years and increasing detention policies that favor increased detention, and then there is between policies that favor increased detention and genuine national security threats. Before I dive into the details of that by saying something about the influence that the for-profit prison industry has had by its lobbying efforts on current administration policies, I just want to say something about where my data comes from. Many of the bits of data I'll be throwing up a bunch of data on the screen, and many of the bits of the data that you'll see up there are from this institute called the Migration Policy Institute, which is a nonpartisan institute dedicated to collecting cutting-edge research on immigration statistics, so as to help promote intelligent policy decisions. They focus on U.S. policy and migration patterns, but they're really more generally do speak to migration questions that arise internationally. To find, this data is going to go by quickly, so to find this data later, if you would like, please do go to our Facebook page, which is Syracuse Divest, and I'll have all of these slides available, if not sometime later today, then by tomorrow. So first, just as a bit of background, the two major publicly traded for-profit prison companies in the US are Geo Group and CoreCivic. I'm assuming everybody in this room knows that there are for-profit prison companies. There are some prisons in the US that are maintained and run by companies for a profit. And the government, state governments, but also the federal government sources out these prison contracts to these companies. And the two major publicly traded companies, they together have cornered about half the for-profit prison market in the US are Geo Group and CoreCivic. Prior to Trump's election, even under Obama, about 62% of all immigrants incarcerated in the US were in for-profit prisons. So quite a high percent, but as we'll see, there's been some massive growth in that under the Trump administration. So let's see, moving right along. Let's see, I'm not sure, it's not, oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm gonna go over this pretty quickly. Although there was expanded detention under the initial years of the Obama administration, towards the end of his administration, he seriously cut back on ICE enforcement. And in August of 2016, he announced that the Federal Bureau of Prisons would no longer be relying on for-profit prisons in which to detain their federal prisoners. The next day, the stocks for those two companies fell dramatically. That same day, the industry donated $150,000 to a pro-Trump super PAC. November 2016, 1 week before the election, Geo Group gives $125,000 to the same pro-Trump super PAC. And one day after his election, the stocks for these companies went massively up. So we can see that it's very important to the health of this industry that we maintain reliance on the service that they're providing, and that one important way of doing so is by rounding up increasing numbers of immigrants and detaining them. Some other sources of influence, so both companies gave $250,000 to the Trump Inaugural Committee. So this is just a timeline of the influence. Around this period, on the 25th, Trump signs an executive order 13767, which it calls for the expansion of immigrant enforcement and expansion of immigrant detention, and also calls for the building of new for-profit prison facilities in which to incarcerate the newly detained immigrants. In the ensuing 2 weeks, the stocks for these two companies surge again. And shortly thereafter, the new Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, rescinds Obama's order winding down the reliance on, rescinds the order winding down the reliance on these prisons. Okay, so there are two questions I want to ask right now. One is, in terms of legislative influence, what are these companies giving? And then I want to ask, in terms of policy, what are they getting? What kind of bang for their buck are they getting? So in 2017, Geo Group spent over $1.7 million on lobbying. That was a 70% increase over 2016. I guess they figured that their investment in the 2016 election turned out to be a winner in terms of how their stock prices changed with Trump's election. Also, Geo Group announced in 2017 that they would henceforth be holding their annual conference at a Trump golf course. In 2017, their combined revenue for these two publicly traded for-profit prison companies was over $4 billion. And their influence continued into 2016 with additional lobbying of Congress. Okay, so what are they getting other than these enormous profits? What are these companies getting? And surges in their stock prices, what are these companies getting for what they're giving? So there's been an increase, a sharp increase in the percentage of incarcerated immigrants who are incarcerated in for-profit prison facilities. It went from about 62% under Obama to 70% under Trump. And that's even though the average number of immigrants detained in this country on any given day rose by 40%. So we're still getting an increased percentage of immigrants detained in for-profit prison facilities at the same time that we have this huge increase in the number of immigrants who are getting detained. So what are some of the policies that are behind this huge increase in the number of immigrants that are being detained in the U.S.? There are a couple of industry-friendly policies I'd like to draw your attention to. This one you may know less about. So there's been a great expansion in mandatory detention. Mandatory detention is what it sounds like. If you meet a certain criteria, then ICE is permitted to round you up or must round you up and detain you. So the Trump administration has given ICE historically broad powers to detain undocumented immigrants. So the class of individuals who were mandatorily detained has greatly expanded. Moreover, ICE in turn has refused, despite an ACLU lawsuit, has refused to make public its guidelines on which it's basing its particular detention decisions. And so this has had the effect, some have complained that this has had the effect of giving ICE the capacity to just lock up immigrants, whether they're criminals or not. Moreover, in a recent court ruling, the Supreme Court has recognized ICE's authority to indefinitely detain any immigrant once they've been taken to a criminal custody, regardless of how many years have passed since their release. So let me just say what that means for a minute. So suppose you're an undocumented immigrant and you were found, perhaps through no fault of your own, in possession of a stolen bus pass 20 years ago. You were taken into criminal custody, perhaps you were released, perhaps you were asked to pay some penalty, you've paid your penalty, and you've left the criminal justice system. What the Supreme Court has held is that such immigrants who have completed whatever penalty they were asked to complete for even relatively small criminal violations like possession of a stolen bus pass, no matter how long ago, you're permitted to, or rather ICE is required to locate and reincarcerate such individuals, and they're permitted to indefinitely detain them. I'll say more about that in a minute. More famous policy, of course, very for-profit prison-friendly policy is, of course, the famous family separation policy. The evil of the family separation policy is probably well known, but the role that for-profit prisons have played in encouraging the administration to implement such policies perhaps less well known. So there's a 1997 law, so how do we get child separation? There's a 1997 law that says children can't be held in immigrant detention for longer than 20 days. So if we of course their parents can be held in detention for longer than 20 days, but they can't if we have to keep the families together. So if you separate children from their families, you can avoid falling foul of the 20-day rule at the same time as keeping their parents in detention for much, much longer periods of time, perhaps indefinitely. Okay, so family separation meant more people could be incarcerated for longer periods of time, and that was good for business. When family separation failed, because of course there was this hue and outcry, Trump's new policy was to allow for children to be incarcerated for longer. So we'll keep families together, but we'll incarcerate children for longer periods of time. In the last week, of course, I hope is well known, Trump has renewed his call for the family separation policy. Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning, we're calling for our university to divest from the for-profit prison industry, and I've just told you something about the role that for-profit prisons have played in creating the immigration nightmare that we are currently seeing in the US. So one question you might ask is, well, how bad is it? We're talking about detention. I mean, hopefully everybody knows that the family separation policy is truly awful. But we might in general wonder, so we're detaining more immigrants, but how bad is it really, you might ask? So the topic of this workshop is immigration and authoritarianism. So let me say a little something about the ways in which this immigration policy is a complete human rights disaster. First thing to know is that the standards governing detention facilities in the immigrant detention facilities in the US are the same standards for pretrial prisons in the US. So it's the same standard as for jails and pretrial prisons, so not a very high standard. We treat these facilities as if they were criminal facilities, yet immigration offenses are civil offenses. They're not criminal offenses. And what that means is that incarcerated immigrants lack the rights that criminal defendants have access to. For example, a court-appointed lawyer. So they're staying in facilities that are of the same standards that are intended for criminals, but they're being held under a civil offense. And getting back to this recent Supreme Court ruling, because their offenses are civil and not criminal, again, they don't have the same rights that criminal defendants have under the US law. So for example, they're not entitled to periodic bond hearings, and that's why the recent Supreme Court ruling is tantamount to saying that they can be held that immigrants can be held in detention indefinitely. Many legal experts, I'm not a legal expert myself, but many legal experts have said that this is a violation of the Constitution's right to due process. I'm going to, in the interest of time, we can talk about this a bit later, but on the topic of immigration, on the topic of immigration and authoritarianism, the Department of Homeland Security has been given a lot of discretionary power over its budget. So Congress gives the DHS all kinds of money for things like immigration courts and immigration lawyers, and immigration judges, and so that cases can be So the cases can be heard in an expeditious way, but DHS has the power to take that funding and funding for FEMA and transfer it over to ICE and enforcement. So that's one consequence. You're no doubt all familiar already with the way in which the family separation policy and detention in general for children is extraordinarily traumatic. So again, these will be on the Syracuse Divest page later. I just give you two photos. This is Yuklin Kahl, who's 7 years old, who died in U.S. Border Patrol custody in last December. This is Felipe Gomez Alonso, who also died the same month, 8 years old. Should I? Yeah, let's come back to it at the end. Okay.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
So, Audie, I'd like to come back to you, and if we can kind of turn back and connect these four presentations a bit. There are several themes that run through. One is the issue of political rhetoric, right? The other is the issue of legal regimes that are guiding immigration or influencing immigration, the role of the media, and finally economics. So both economics as a driving factor, but also as Sefa and as Shana mentioned, and as you mentioned, there's also this idea of refugees and migrants as an economic threat to the existing political order. So I'm wondering, in your own research, both on an international level and then as you've looked at the U.S. as a comparative, how do those factors interrelate, and is one more predominant than the other? The political rhetoric or political opportunism around it versus economics versus the role of the media in kind of shaping political discourse?
So I am not a media specialist. I'm actually more of a structuralist. So I'll let Shana weigh in on some of the media questions. I will point out that securitization theory has a lot of people who have studied the role of the media and some of the political rhetoric. So there are plenty of scholars that could answer that question. I think one of the mythologies, actually, the years and years of migration research shows is that there is no direct connection between economics and migration patterns or reactions to migration patterns. So I think we can eliminate that, even though it's a recurring issue. So some of the general considerations, there's usually a significant lag between, say, a dip in the economy or a rise in the economy and its effect on migration flows. Especially since 1965 in the United States, most migration flows, just in terms of the percentages, are through family unification. Most of the undocumented people in the United States come in on valid visas. So there's tons and tons of kind of empirical work that has been done on the United States and other countries that basically shows some of the more kind of classic, its economic factors kind of arguments go by the wayside. I think then it comes down to how is immigration or migration used politically, and that's where I think there are a lot of variations in countries in particular times, and then we could get into some of the specifics if you want to.
Yeah, you want to just give an example or two?
Okay, so in the United States, there is this narrative that people want to come to the United States because we are the most desirable place to be in the world. The streets are paved with gold. You probably all recognize variants of that rhetoric. Many of us are from immigrant roots in some way, shape, or another, so it resonates. This idea of a kind of idealized notion of especially European migration. So even, this is where I was kind of pushing back on being careful about the use of the term refugee. Even people who are trying to express solidarity with the idea that people from Mexico or Central America might want to come to the United States, they end up invoking and reiterating this kind of mythology in the American political narrative. And this goes against actually some of the more precise ways in which legal advocates can actually effectively protect people who do have a legitimate right to claim asylum. So there's a tension there. Everybody, even people on, not Stephen Miller, right? Even the people who want to advocate for responses that are humanitarian and challenging the more draconian or authoritarian bents end up falling into the trap because we don't actually have a more thorough understanding that even at the same time that certain people from Europe were welcomed, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act and some other very repressive aspects of American policy.
Thank you. Shane, do you want to jump in there and discuss some of the, perhaps connecting to your own research, but then more broadly on media impacts and media shaping of discourse?
Sure. So I think the media plays a big role in two ways. One is most people have very little direct experience both with terrorism and with immigration. And so a lot of what they're learning about those issues comes from information they get through the mass media. And so the media has this role to play in both kind of telling people what elites want them to know about these issues and shaping their emotions around it. So some of my earlier work, so as a somewhat aside, I've been kind of looking at the role of attitudes about terrorism and foreign policy and immigration since 2003, and someone in 2008 said, like, why are you looking at all this threat stuff? Isn't this the era of hope and change? And I was like, well, I feel like this is a topic that will last me. And in fact, sadly for the society, good for my research, it has. But the mass media provides this kind of space where, again, people learn about things, but they also they feel things. And I think the fact that terrorism is, for my own work, terrorism is quite prominent in the news. It's focused, it's very sensational when you see it, and that often the people who you hear most loudest, with loudest voices that are calling for restrictions on immigration are the ones that you hear in connection. And also, by the way, when you hear about terrorism and when things are labeled terrorism, they're much more likely to have a perpetrator who's Muslim, right? So all of these ways in which the construction of what is terrorism, who are the perpetrators of terrorism, who are the victims of terrorism, and then how that is connected to public policy, it goes through who gets covered in the media and how those messages are framed.
So in a way, this connects to the film last night, where one of the things that was discussed was the 40 years of demonization of Japanese in the U.S. And for Muslims, Arabs, et cetera, there's an even longer kind of a century plus wide, and some would even take it even further back, the British French Empire. But this also, Sefa, in your own research, you're seeing a reaction that's also more nationalist based, right? So when you look at Lebanon and Turkey, it's not so much a demonization of them as Muslims or as Arabs, but as Syrians. And so do you want to talk a little bit about that? Sure. And if there's a role of the media, or how much of this is driven by another factor?
Yeah. I think different aspects of Syrian identity play different roles in different countries. Can you guys hear? Yeah. For example, like, in Turkey, ethnic identity, kind of like Arab ethnic identity, becomes the major cause of alienation or exclusion, of refugees. For example, in Lebanon, since there is a shared Arab identity, not the Arab identity, but the sectarian religious identity becomes a ground for exclusion. And for European countries, mainly economic issues aside, they're seen as a kind of potential burden on the economy. But I think this relationship between, Muslim refugees and kind of like terror becomes a kind of like, a ground to not to admit refugees or to kind of like, present them as a threat to the society. Yes, like different aspects of Syrian refugee identity, I think impacts their securitization in different ways in different countries. And there are many ironies, like in states' policies towards refugees. I think that's not the original question, but I think that's worth mentioning here. For example, like from Turkish case, in 2018, there was going to be there would be the first presidential elections in the country, and before the elections, Erdogan brought up this idea of granting citizenship to Syrian refugees. And in Turkey, Turkey signed the UNHCR's convention, like the UN Convention on Refugees, but kind of like put a restriction on the treaty and doesn't accept refugees from refugees from the Middle Eastern countries, but does not recognize them as refugees under the convention. Only those who come from European countries are recognized as refugees, in Turkish laws. And despite this, despite the fact that Syrians are not even recognized as refugees, they have this temporary protection status, the president was offering citizenship. That's an irony. Like, those people don't even have refugee status under international law, and now you're coming and offering them full citizenship. And that was just because of the fact that there would be local, presidential elections, and Erdogan wanted to create a new support base, and 3.5 million Syrian refugees could vote for him in the elections and could make him win the elections. And that was the logic behind it. And in Lebanon, I think that's quite ironic. In Lebanon, in 2015, government passed a legislation kind of like still allowing, different groups of Syrians to come to Lebanon. Syrian businessmen, Syrian, scholars, they can come in, under different visa statuses to Lebanon, but they restricted Syrian refugees. That's the segment of Syrian population that is, under dire need of help, but they were kind of excluded from those groups of Syrians who could enter Lebanon. I think I can stop here and then I can continue.
So I want to just jump in and feel free to, whoever wants to answer, because I think one of the aspects that may help confuse this are the governing legal regimes, particularly here in the United States. So whether, including everything from visa status to what is your actual immigration status within the country. So I'm curious, because it's not that well understood, how much do you think that plays into, especially when you hear terms being thrown around like illegal immigrant versus migrant versus visa card or green card holder? And I'm wondering, Audie, if you want to take that or if you want to.
Let me jump in with one example. I heard recently, I thought this was fabulous. I heard recently somebody say, the best way to think about people entering the country outside of formal borders and then being detained is to ask yourself whether you think anybody who's had a speeding ticket should be put in detention. Because that's the level in a legal process of the infraction. The way in which the rhetoric describes it is, that these are criminals and whatnot. Well, there's actually a third part of the American legal system. The immigration legal system is a whole separate legal system. Right, so if you it's basically like the equivalent of a misdemeanor or breaking administrative law. Right, it's definitely not part of the criminal system. It's not really part of the standard civil system either. And this is one of the reasons why migrants in detention don't have the standard legal protections, right to lawyers and some of these other kinds of things, because this is a separate legal system. So people talk about a couple things. Sometimes appeals will end up in the circuit court system, and that's mostly what we see in terms of the legal challenges that make it into the news. The other thing that has been in the news lately is calls that really what the system needs is more immigration court system judges. Right, so that the cases can be prosecuted quicker on their own grounds. In the United States, very few lawyers actually get training in immigration law. It is an optional course in most law schools. There are very few law schools that actually have sophisticated versions of it. You talk to some immigration lawyers and legitimate ones, and they basically describe a lot of people in the profession as like bottom feeders, taking advantage of really vulnerable people and not really offering them quality legal service. So there's all sorts of problems in the American legal process. Let me just, by comparison, also just tell you it's possible to have different legal systems. The Canadian system is sometimes criticized for taking too long because they allow too many appeals, and then people end up appealing the appeal, and by then they have settled in communities, they have married people, have children or whatever, and then they end up not going to be deported because they can show significant investment in the community and whatnot. So there are people in other contexts. In South Africa, they designed a new constitution. The current one was actually implemented in 1996, so a little lag from the first universal suffrage elections. And at the time, they didn't think of immigration as a problem. They were responding to the apartheid system, and there's a key feature in the post-apartheid constitution that guarantees a whole bunch of rights to anybody who is in South Africa. And that went through the constitutional court system, and it was reaffirmed that that meant regardless of citizenship status. But in terms of implementation, people are guaranteed right to education, right to health care. But in practice, at the implementation level, there are a lot of hospitals and schools that will not accept children into the school system and stuff like that. So you can still have even legal protections at the national constitutional level, and that doesn't guarantee on the ground that people will be able to exercise those rights.
Sure. I mean, I think on the public side, there's different attitudes toward people who are perceived to be economic migrants versus people who are refugees. And the support for refugees, while not very high, is higher than for support for people who are economic migrants in the U.S. I've done work on, so I think there's also misinformation about the kinds of programs that people who are here and undocumented have access to. So the public has a sense that the undocumented people can get access to state programs, which they are not. They cannot. But there is support in the surveys I've done with the American public for what my co-author and I call humanitarian policies, which is the purpose of these studies that we did was to make people scared about immigration. And even if you make them scared about immigration on a variety of ways, we haven't been able to dampen their support for things like kids who are undocumented being able to go to schools and access the ER. So again, while the support level is not very high for undocumented people getting access to services, people do have a sense that at least kids who are somewhat blameless in the system shouldn't be kicked out of schools and shouldn't have no access to medical care because they are themselves undocumented or have. And again, support for DACA, I think, we put in that same kind of category, which is to the extent that people believe that kids who are brought here and undocumented as children should have access to, if not a path to citizenship, then at least some access to services and shouldn't be deported. Support for DACA is pretty high in the American public.
So I want to pick up on both of these threads and also throw this out if you want. So as part of the family separation policy, we reached this ludicrous level where you have immigration attorneys who are actually representing clients at the pre-verbal stage. And so, I mean, it almost becomes a farce in the courtroom. And so I wanted to throw that out as kind of another example of, because to your point, and this also connects to Sefa's research, the worthy versus unworthy refugees, how children are viewed, and yet we haven't been able to come up, or we as a society or as a country, been able to come up with an effective manner of dealing with this issue. And I'm wondering if you want to remark on, does family separation, because I want to transition into this kind of strategies of resistance or opposition, does the family separation policy offer one opportunity for challenging or at least some kind of immigration reform? So I'll leave that open to the panel and whoever wants to respond. If you want to start, Sefa or Audie, if you want to.
I'm going to let you guys start because I've been talking.
I generally just study things that make people scared or disgusted or angry. But one of my new projects is looking at the role of empathy in immigration policy and whether or not building empathy can actually make people resistant, right, and more supportive of immigration, and whether or not empathy is an emotion that can counter fear. And so one of the things I think in talking about the role of lobbying, what the public wants as a kind of whole matters only to the extent that you can put collective action behind it. And one of the things that lobbying is really good at is collective action and actually getting a strong signal about what industries want. And so the public, while is extraordinarily actually negative about family separation, is very ambivalent about immigration as a whole. And so what you saw after the family separation is collective action. You see protest, you see very strong action and calling members of Congress, and that can counter some of the kind of more single voices maybe in industry. But I think until we get to that point where the public speaks in a single voice and can put pressure in the same ways that lobbying does. I'll also say that lobbyists give money because they already agree with politicians, and so it may be the case that the Trump administration was already going to do a lot of these things without the for-profit companies giving him money to do that, right? I think this is ideologically in his wheelhouse anyway, but I think one of the strengths that the public has is to bring a lot of pressure, but until they know what they want or don't want, then it's just opinion on paper.
would you want to say something there?
So this is where Shana and I disagree. I don't think there is such a thing as the American public in a homogeneous sort of way. And I think immigration policy and years of documenting what the so-called strange bedfellows are that lead to certain types of immigration policy in the United States is a good example of this. There are really strong social groups within the United States that are based on ethnic communities, immigrant communities. Sometimes they're affiliated with other large organizations like the Catholic Church, which has been hugely influential both at local and national levels. There's a classic split within the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, which is where the strange bedfellows argument comes from, and why immigration reform is always so difficult, because it doesn't fall across party lines. So if the pro-immigrant sort of lobby and social movements primarily have been in the through the Democratic Party. The other side on the Democratic Party has been the union movement, which is a classic restrictionist policy typically. Unions in general, with the decline of manufacturing, have also generally declined. So some of the anti-immigrant momentum from that aspect of politics has also weakened. There are a couple of, like the Service International Union, that have become much more stronger public activists on pro-immigrant positions. On the more classic Republican side, you see a split between who are the employers, and typically there was a division between employers who benefited from immigrant labor and those employers who did not or weren't reliant on it. That is also changing structurally. So the employers generally, aside from the Trump businesses, which is leading to, you might have noticed in the last couple of days, an increase in the number of temporary workers that can work in places like the Trump businesses. But the main employers generally at this point are like the large IT companies, large universities, and those are the people who are on the opposite side. They're filing the amicus briefs against the Muslim ban and all that kind of stuff. Trump and that faction of the Republican Party can't stand those interests. They're not going to come around to those interests. They're going to be happy to play up, the prison industrial complex and some of that kind of stuff. Prison industrial complex, those of us in upstate New York or I'm from Illinois, those tend to be located in relatively rural areas where there aren't a lot of other jobs. Those are also people in general, including some of my extended family, that are more likely to vote for the Trump side of the political spectrum in general. I mean, these are self-reinforcing. It's not a complete shock, some of these things. So I am very skeptical that anybody's sympathy, I agree that there is an exceptional sympathy, especially for DACA, but I don't think that level of sympathy, especially because it is more likely to be in urban areas and in blue states, is going to do anything really substantial in terms of the political compromises or deals.
So I just wanted to jump in on your point because I think this is a good example. So this is, for those who don't know, the Dilley Family Detention Center, which is the largest in the country. And it's actually located in an area, to Audie's point, that's very similar to kind of central upstate New York, which was economically depressed until these centers started being built, private prisons and then federal prisons. And they started to employ, as we learned last night, prison guards who were from the area of Mexican-American descent. So the prison guards are actually dealing with a population that is just the newest range of immigrants to the country. The tape you heard comes from this center. And so there's also this idea of kind of, from what we heard last night, that there's a real discrimination towards the new migrants who come in by Mexican Americans and a lack of identification, which is interesting. So I want to turn that over to Jan and get your...
I actually wanted to add a second question in case Jan knows this. The prison industrial complex is not unique to the United States, so I'm wondering, are these actually these may be publicly traded on the U.S. stock markets, but are they actually transnational corporations? Or what's the financial mapping there?
Yeah. So a lot of great questions, and I want to I want to back up a little bit and try to just talk about some of the stuff that I think is important to get out today. So one thing that I'm learning today is that there's a different ways that political scientists and a moral philosopher might approach some of these questions. So I'm not particularly, I confess myself, very interested in what Trump is thinking. I find myself not particularly interested in what it's not that I'm not interested at all, but it's not my central focus. I'm also not, first and foremost, interested in why voters, how voters can be influenced by the media, except insofar as it affects policy, influences policy. I don't think of voters as this entity to be a set of individuals to be studied as if they're this, strange thing that we found in a petri dish. I think that voters are us, and so the question is not what influences other people. The question is what has it influenced? What in fact features of the world have influenced the current policies? Do we think the current policies are evil? And if we think they're evil, what are we going to do about them? So it may well be that the explanation for why the industry has so strongly supported Trump, who's independently expressed support for the for-profit prison. So it's not just that the industry has recognized a simpatico individual and someone who wants to pursue draconian immigration policies. They've also recognized a simpatico individual who just thinks that private prisons are great. He said this repeatedly on the campaign trail, very explicitly. But setting aside whether Trump really thinks that private prisons are great and way better than publicly run prisons, which, by the way, go to the ACLU webpage, go to the Southern Poverty Law Center webpage, you'll see that they're pursuing both of the for-profit prisons in court on the grounds of grotesque human rights violations. So the answer is these prisons are much worse than publicly run prisons. But set aside the question about whether Trump, for some reason, really believes that private prisons are great and immigrants pouring over our southern border are being infiltrated by scary Muslims who are going to come and blow everything up. Set aside whether he believes that. Set aside, I would believe that maybe voters have generally been convinced by that. The point is that we have the draconian immigration policies that we have now because these companies have made it much more likely that we're going to elect individuals who support these policies, whether they support them independently or not. They've found these candidates who support really draconian, inhumane, unjust immigration policies, and they have made them much more electable, and they have influenced the legislation process once they have gotten there with lots and lots and lots of money, and it's great business for them. Their profits are soaring. They're making profits hand over fist, and it's a direct result of these immigration policies. So that's just cause and effect, regardless of who knows what Trump believes. That's just cause and effect. So then the question is, now that we know what the effect is and what the cause is, what are we going to do about it? I hope we can all agree in this room. I mean, speaking as someone who works on moral philosophy, these questions, a lot of questions that moral philosophers are interested in are incredibly hard. Like, for example, is it ever morally permissible to intentionally take a human life? That's a complicated one, and different moral theories will come out differently on that question. But whether or not, for the sake of companies to make profits so that we can, by keeping their parents in detention for a longer period of time, it's morally permissible to separate children from their parents, given what we know about the lifelong trauma that we can expect those children to experience as a result. Is that morally permissible? The clear, resounding answer to that is no. There's no plausible moral theory on which that's morally permissible. That's just wrong. That's just evil. So we know how we got here. And we know that it's evil. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Now, we can say things like, well, people don't like family separation, so if we focus more on that, we can influence other people. But we don't have to sit around waiting to change people's hearts and minds. There's something we can do right here at Syracuse University, if I can be permitted to go on for a bit. Syracuse University is one of the only 90 colleges and universities in this country with an endowment of over $1 billion. So that is a chunk of change. And what Syracuse Divest has asked, with the support of the Faculty Senate, the University Senate, the Graduate Student Organization, and the Undergraduate Student Assembly have all passed resolutions speaking strongly with one voice, demanding that the university publicly commit to divesting from these companies. And the university's response at the May Board of Trustees meetings from last year was a resounding no. And not only was it a no, they refused to tell us why it was a no. So they've repeatedly refused to commit to publicly commit to for-profit prison divestment, which would directly have the result of depriving the industry of some of the money that it uses from investors in order to expand its business. But the public commitment also would indirectly strike a blow against these companies by saying to the world, Syracuse universities, like Georgetown University, like the entire University of California system, like Columbia University, is a moral leader in this world, and we just refused to contribute to the maintenance of this evil industry. We will not profit from it, and we will not promote its maintenance. And as a result of that, we could, like Columbia and Georgetown and these other universities, inspire other entities, not just colleges and universities, but cities, counties, and states to do the same.
So I want to expand that now, because I want to use that to bridge to the strategies of resistance. So divestment is one option, divestment of the private prison industry. I'm wondering if there are other strategies that you can pick up on from your own research or other examples that could actually be used here to influence, whether at the political level, the policy level, non-governmental organizations. I can start with Shana, and then we can go around.
I'm going to just back up a second to suggest that while I think divestment is really important, and I am not, you shouldn't take this as a plug for private prisons or my position, I would suggest that the cause and effect is not nearly as clear as lobbying causes policy outcomes. And so that's what I'm going to say for political science. And we're happy to talk about that. Yeah. So I actually think the problem is us and I think the problem is the public, and partially it's the government system, but I think in terms of strategies for resistance is really more about social movements and working on empathy and working on the public to put pressure on the system, but to also in ways that I think it's very easy to make people scared about immigration. And make immigration seem like a problem. I think building up kind of good feeling and the sense that immigration is a good is the work that has to be done.
Yeah. Actually, in relation to that, maybe I could say a couple of things. Like we tend to think that political parties kind of proposing their policies in isolation to what public demands in some cases. And I agree with the fact that, political parties' positions on the matters of migration are kind of reflections of their understanding of people's demands and sentiments. And for example, in most of the European countries nowadays, we see a rise of the right-wing political parties. I think there are unaddressed and unvoiced concerns of people about, foreigners, about migrants in those countries, and political parties are just appealing to those feelings and sentiments. I think that's probably the same for Marquez countries as well. And in this case, I think the main issue is kind of changing the perception of public towards migration and towards refugees. And I think that requires kind of public education. And educating the public about these matters and really understanding this refugee experience and how it's a kind of humanitarian experience rather than a political one, and why it wouldn't really relate to very deep, very kind of like significant political issues immediately. I think that's the needed kind of reform. Yeah.
So I have two responses to the question, both of which were kind of previewed in my opening comments. One is as a kind of citizen with obligations, responsibilities, as well as, in this case, how to leverage my own research in the classroom. So on the first one, I already said I had this kind of moment, out-of-body experience where I thought, well, and I've thought about this for many years, what would I have done if I had actually been born in South Africa and raised in South Africa? My family is from different immigrant communities that came to the United States, but those are some of the very same immigrant communities that ended up in South Africa or wherever. So there's always that kind of feeling of contingency, not that I somehow belong here or own it. So one of the most inspiring organizations that I had learned about during the apartheid years was called Black Sash, and it was an organization of sort of liberal white women who would do silent protests in front of Parliament and stuff like that. And I always found that very inspiring because I have this Gandhian influence in me in terms of the value of public protest. What actually I have done in the last 2 years, I mentioned this, is give a lot of money to organizations, including the ACLU and SPLC, but other organizations that are the ones who are actually doing the lawsuits, because I'm not actually trained as a lawyer, and I sometimes wonder whether or not I should have, but at the time I was making choices that wasn't on my radar, along with other career options. Then there's this question, what about my academic specialty and how do I leverage that in the classroom? Because this is a very touchstone issue, and we live in a university and a community that has very diverse voices. I live in suburban Syracuse. I have some very conservative neighbors. I got into a fight at a neighborhood party once with one of my very best friends, sort of family, parent friends, who's a very conservative Catholic, and started spewing out this, anti-Islam kind of like insanity stuff. And it was the only time any of my neighbors have ever seen me lose it. Because I try really hard to have a really balanced perspective, but then that kind of translated back to me like, no, I actually need to leverage the things that I do know about and pull them into the classroom, because I have students in my class who are feeling very vulnerable. And my job is not to try to balance between the MAGA hat wearing people and the headscarf wearing people. My obligation, partly because of the principles of this university, is to address these issues front and center. So I have pictures of the Confederate flag. We read about, instead of civil war in Syria, we read about civil war in the United States in the mid-1800s. It's a process. It's a work in process. My one last comment back to Jan is my other hat was doing a lot of research on the sanctions against apartheid, and I have some really strong views about the strengths and serious limits to divestment. I firmly believe there is a principled stand that I totally support about not being associated with evil, as you phrase it, but I don't think that that's going to solve that problem.
So a couple comments. One, I also have an activist background in the divestment movement, which I think was very effective in getting Western governments to pull their financial support for the white apartheid regime in South Africa. Many of you may not know, but the companies that were doing business in South Africa under apartheid were spending massive amounts of money in the form of taxes to support that regime. And it was precisely because the divestment movement was so successful that so many companies pulled out of South Africa, and that was a serious financial blow to the apartheid government. Did it lead to the fall of apartheid by itself? No, of course not. The ANC and Nelson Mandela played the heavy lifting role in that process. But depriving the white South African government of the means to repress the Black South Africans played an important role in that. I want to say I am an activist, but I don't have a simplistic view. So my view is not, of course, that the lobbying efforts of the for-profit prison industry fully explain by themselves why we have the evil immigration policies that we currently have. I mention them because they're a significant influence in the way that if you strike a match, the explanation for why the match lit is not, of course, just that the match struck, but all the oxygen around it. But you might mention the striking of the match as playing an important role in explaining why the match lit. So too, often when you give causal explanations, you focus on the surprise or or a dominant factor that is playing an important causal role. So it's not that I think that the for-profit lobbying by for-profit prisons gives the complete explanation, causal explanation for why our current immigration policy is the way that it is. Many of them have to do with the things that were talked about today, like the impact that misleading rhetoric about national security threats can prey on voters' fears. But the explanation for why it is that part of the explanation for why those politicians could be successful, why they were able to get their message out to the extent to which they were, was because they had so much damn money. And one of the reasons why they had so much damn money is because there was a lot of money to be made by for-profit prisons, precisely in the success of those immigration policies.
Okay, so I want to turn it out to questions. Do we have a question in the back? Go with Ennis.
I'm first. You want to go with Ennis first?
No. Yeah.
Hi. So it was brought up twice, and are there examples of undocumented immigrants being denied emergency health care or access to public education? And if so, can you explain?
I'm sure there are examples someplace, right? But part of the Proposition 197 in California in the early 1990s was to take undocumented kids who were in public schools and then kick them out of schools, essentially to not give them access to public schooling. This had a relatively strong effect in moving Latinos and liberal whites into the Democratic Party in California. But there are these kinds of propositions, and there are private businesses, right? I mean, we get these stories in the news about private businesses refusing to serve people who speak Spanish and those kinds of things, which is not about documented status. But so my work is looking at whether or not people support these kinds of policies. And there's not a ton of support for taking these kinds of policies like education from kids who are undocumented or denying health care. But it is not the case that people who are undocumented can get access to Medicare or Medicaid or food stamps. And that's kind of a myth that people have, that undocumented immigrants can get access to social welfare policies in most places.
Or even voting, right? I mean, so there's, I think one of the things you want to think about is that there's a number of myths, to Professor Gadarian's point, that have been spread about what quote unquote illegal immigrants can do, right? So those without documentation, that includes things like voting, includes access to Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps is always a common one. And these are played on, these fears and these kinds of myths and quite frankly, kind of racist notions that are played on to kind of demonize migrants, right? But yeah, there's plenty of examples out there of denials, both at the emergency room and including fear of going to the emergency room because of especially the past few years, ICE raids, right? Even going to immigration appointments, right, that are scheduled because you'll be arrested or you're the parent who's driving you. So one of the issues, for example, and this is, I'm kind of abusing my role as chair, so tell me to be quiet out of it if you want. But one of the issues, for example, with the family separation is that some of the family members that have been identified by some of these undocumented juveniles so they have family here in the United States, aunts, uncles, cousins, etc. They give that information to customs officials Some families have been unwilling to come pick them up because they're worried that it's going to be used as a trap to arrest them and then deport them. So there are a number of different levels of this, and I can, if you want, just see me afterwards, and any one of us can point you to a number of organizations that are documenting this very well. Anybody wants to add? Feel free, please.
Hello. I have two questions. One is about the connection between immigration refugee waves and how they're seen as a national security threat. I think it has a lot to do with how citizens of those countries perceive their nation, how they imagine their nation. So, because we can talk rationally all we want. We can say, the Republic of Turkey took like 4 million refugees, and compared to all continental Europe took like 1 million or 1.5 million. So many Turkish people say Europeans are exaggerating it and whatnot. But the Western nationalists will tell you we're not thinking in terms of 10 years, 20 years. We're thinking in terms of 100 years. 200 years. And we see the, quote unquote, our native fertility rate. You can see all signs of this in the so-called manifesto, for example, of the Christchurch attackers. To him, it was the defeat was already, he already sees this as a defeat already. Rational voter model has been discounted by neurosciences literature. People vote emotionally. So I think we need to talk more about how we can create functioning, safe societies that are completely heterogeneous. I think people think that academics and whatnot, experts are delaying this debate by saying, this is not a problem, you guys are exaggerating this. And another thing I want to ask, so those far-right nationalists, they see a couple of countries as models. To this, I want to ask directly to Professor Klotz. For example, you said apartheid didn't work in South Africa, but they had the quote-unquote demographic disadvantage, so the dominants there were small. Now, these far-right, if you delve into their writings, they see Israel, they see China as models, and they see that it is working. They're not facing the trajectories that their native population will be a minority compared to Europeans and, in America. So, yeah, I just want to get your thoughts on that.
I'm not really clear what your question is on that last point.
Do you want to clarify the question? I do want to commend you, though, for attacking academics in your first question now. I want to thank you for that.
Soften
way to work the room, Enes. All right.
Well, you're quite familiar with that, so can I say? It's just that just because it didn't work in South Africa, that's the impression I got. It's not a given in many ways.
Okay, so yeah. What I specifically am trying to underscore, which may not have been as clear, is that the link between having authoritarian-style, militarized border and domestic surveillance. South Africa makes contemporary Trump policy look like amateur hour. If that level of resource, with such disregard for people's life, let alone rights, could not prevent migration flows, then no attempt by the Trump administration can actually accomplish their goal. But we also see a similar dynamic historically. For instance, the nationality quotas that were implemented in 1920 and 1924 had a significant negative impact on migration flows from parts of the world where my family came from, Eastern and Southern Europe. There was already the Chinese exclusion from the 1800s. But people snuck across the Canadian border. We have a Customs and Border Patrol because in 1924 they were worried about the Canadian border, not because of Mexico. So certain flows from Europe were cut off, Asian flows were cut off, but there were plenty of, especially Mexicans, who were coming and going. So there was always some other dimension or aspect or avenue through which people will reach their country of destination. Perhaps not in the same demographic flows, perhaps not in the same numbers, as if those relatively draconian policies hadn't existed. But you can't stop people from moving. They will find a way.
Yeah. You want to add?
Yeah, maybe I can just regarding his first kind of like comment, not question, but I think in general, maybe like, if I'm not a psychologist, but I think one could say that fear is a more effective sentiment than love and inclusion. I think when people are fearful, they can do anything and everything. And I think we see that in states' immigration policies as well. Like, for example, just a political, that would be a political example. Just think about the EU-Turkey deal, right? The relations between Turkey and EU were like totally frozen in 2014, right? And given the refugee crisis, the relations were restored, and the EU wanted to strike a deal with Turkey, not because they really wanted Turkey to become a member of the EU, right? Apparently, because there were millions of refugees lining up in the borders, and they didn't want to, admit those refugees, and they wanted Turkey to deal with those refugees in the first place. Yes, I think there has been a great achievement in human history, like in terms of forming liberal states and democratic states. But I think these humanitarian crises become important tests for those political systems, and I think so far we have not given a good test, I would say, universally, and I think that's still a challenge for not for developed democratic Western countries, but also for the countries who are trying to emulate the Western values. Okay, well, yeah.
And on that note, I want to thank you, because that actually ties in well with the broader theme. So thanks, everybody, for coming, and have a good weekend.